Most people think the Anglo-Saxons disappeared, that they belong to a distant world of kings, monasteries, and muddy battlefields, a people trapped inside history books and museum glass, eventually replaced by the English who came later. But modern genetics tells a very different story. When scientists began extracting DNA from early medieval skeletons buried across England, when archaeologists started comparing ancient genomes to living populations, and when historians mapped settlement patterns against modern ancestry data, something surprising emerged. The Anglo-Saxons did not vanish. In many parts of England, they became the population, and millions of people alive today may carry their DNA without ever realizing it. Most families do not preserve dramatic stories about Saxon warriors crossing the North Sea. There are no legendary swords hanging above fireplaces, or ancient crests tracing back to Mercia or Wessex. Instead, the evidence survives in quieter places, in surnames, in village names, in regional DNA patterns, in ancient cemeteries beneath modern towns, and in family lines that stayed rooted in the same counties for centuries. The strange thing is that most people imagine English ancestry as simple, but it is one of the most layered identities on Earth. Before the Anglo-Saxons came, Roman Britain already existed. Before the Romans, Celtic-speaking peoples lived across the island. Then came the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from what is now northern Germany and Denmark. Centuries later came the Vikings, followed by the Normans, who themselves descended partly from Vikings. England was never built from a single people. It was built from waves. But one of the most important waves was the Anglo-Saxon migration because, unlike the Romans, they did not simply rule Britain and leave, they settled it. They farmed the land, built villages, raised families, and spoke a language that eventually evolved into English itself. That means Anglo-Saxon ancestry is not some rare or exotic bloodline hidden deep in the past. For millions of people, it may form the foundation of their entire family tree. And yet most people have no idea how to recognize the signs. So in this video, we are going to explore 7 hidden clues your family may carry Anglo-Saxon ancestry. Some are linguistic, some are geographic, some are genetic, and some hide inside traditions most people never question. None of these signs alone proves ancestry, but together they form patterns. Historians, genealogists, archaeologists, and genetic researchers increasingly recognize. And by the end of this video, you may look at your own surname, your family's home region, or even your DNA test very differently. Because the Anglo-Saxons did not disappear into history. In many ways, history became them. Before we get into the signs, we need to understand who the Anglo-Saxons actually were, because even that is more complicated than most people realize. The term Anglo-Saxon is really a modern umbrella label. The people themselves came from several Germanic groups, primarily the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who crossed the North Sea into Britain beginning in the 5th century after Roman authority collapsed. And contrary to the older version of history many people learned in school, they were not simply invading armies, wiping out the native population overnight. Modern archaeology and DNA research suggest something far more complex happened. Some areas experienced large-scale migration. Some saw blending between newcomers and local Britons. Some communities remained mostly native while gradually adopting Anglo-Saxon culture and language. Early England was formed through both migration and assimilation. Over time, however, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms became dominant. Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, kingdoms whose borders helped shape England itself. And wherever these settlers established long-term communities, traces of them remained not just in books, but in living people. Sign number 1. Your surname contains Old English roots older than the Norman conquest. This is one of the clearest clues because surnames preserve history in ways most people never notice. Many English surnames sound perfectly ordinary today, but underneath them are fragments of Old English spoken over 1,000 years ago. Names like Godwin, Aldridge, Oswald, Edmonds, Harwood, Elwood, Chadwick, or Whitaker often trace back to Old English naming systems or settlement patterns that existed before 1066. That matters, because after the Norman conquest, Norman French culture transformed England's elite identity. Thousands of older Anglo-Saxon names disappeared from the upper classes entirely, but many survived among ordinary rural families, especially in regions where populations remained relatively stable for centuries. Some surnames preserve direct Old English personal names. Others preserve occupations or descriptions of the landscape. Whitaker originally referred to a white field. Harwood meant hair forest. Becket referred to a small brook. These linguistic fossils matter because language survives through continuity. A surname passed down for hundreds of years can preserve ancestry older than written records themselves. Researchers studying medieval naming patterns consistently find stronger Anglo-Saxon continuity in families whose roots remained concentrated in rural English counties, especially outside areas heavily reshaped by Norman aristocracy. Sign number 2. Your family comes from regions historically linked to Anglo-Saxon settlement. Geography matters enormously because the Anglo-Saxons did not settle England evenly. Some regions became major centers of Anglo-Saxon culture, while others retained stronger Celtic influence or later absorbed large Viking populations. If your ancestry comes primarily from counties like Norfolk, Suffolk, Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, Northamptonshire, Warwickshire, Oxfordshire, Hampshire, or Sussex, there's a strong chance your family line sits inside historic Anglo-Saxon settlement zones, especially if your family remained there for generations. East Anglia in particular was one of the strongest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Ancient cemeteries discovered there contain some of the clearest archaeological evidence of early Germanic settlement in Britain. Modern genetic studies repeatedly show stronger continental northern European ancestry signals in these regions compared to Western Britain. The same pattern appears across parts of the Midlands and southern England, and this does not mean everyone from these regions is purely Anglo-Saxon. No population works that way. But ancestry accumulates geographically. Families who remained in the same regions for centuries often carry deeper continuity with earlier populations who lived there before them. And in England, many of those earlier populations were Anglo-Saxon communities. Sign number 3. Your local place names sound strangely repetitive. Once you notice this, you cannot unsee it. The Anglo-Saxons renamed enormous parts of England, and those names still dominate modern maps. Villages ending in Ham, Tun, Ley, Worth, Bury, Stoke, Fold, or Hurst often traced directly back to Old English. Ham meant homestead. Tun meant enclosed settlement. Ley referred to woodland clearings. Worth meant enclosed farm. Bury came from fortified places. These were not random labels. They described how Anglo-Saxon communities organized land and settlement. If your family has deep roots in villages carrying these suffixes, especially across southern and eastern England, you are often looking at settlement geography dating back over 1,000 years. And the fascinating part is that place name historians can sometimes map migration patterns through names alone. Entire clusters of Old English settlement names reveal where communities expanded, farmed, intermarried, and stayed, meaning your family's village itself may preserve evidence of the people who first settled it during the Anglo-Saxon era. Sign number 4. Your DNA test shows strong English, Danish, or Northwestern German ancestry without a recent explanation. This is where modern genetics changes the conversation entirely. Ancient DNA studies from early medieval English cemeteries have shown strong similarities between Anglo-Saxon remains and populations from northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. That makes sense historically because those were the migration zones where many Anglo-Saxon groups originated before crossing into Britain. So when modern DNA tests show strong northwestern European ancestry concentrated around England, Denmark, or northern Germany, especially without recent immigrant ancestors explaining it, researchers increasingly believe some of that signal may reflect very old migration patterns. Not a recent grandparent from Hamburg, but ancestors who crossed the North Sea 15 centuries ago. The fascinating thing is that many English people underestimate how genetically mixed England became during this era. The older idea that Anglo-Saxons were merely a tiny ruling class is fading. Several studies suggest migration into eastern England was substantial enough to reshape local populations significantly, especially in parts of East Anglia in the southeast. Sign number 5. Your paternal haplogroup connects strongly to Germanic populations. This takes us deeper into genetic ancestry, a Y chromosome. Haplogroups trace direct paternal lines stretching back thousands of years, and certain haplogroups appear repeatedly in populations associated with Germanic migrations into Britain, especially R1b U106 and I1. R1b U106 appears strongly across northwestern Germany and regions historically connected to Anglo-Saxon migration, while I1 is heavily associated with Scandinavian and Germanic populations. Now this is important. A haplogroup alone does not make someone Anglo-Saxon. Human ancestry is always more complicated than that. But when these markers align with English regional ancestry, settlement geography, surnames, and historical continuity, they become part of a larger pattern researchers take seriously. Ancient DNA extracted from Anglo-Saxon cemeteries shows overlaps with these same genetic signatures, meaning your paternal line may preserve echoes of migration events that happened over 1,500 years ago. Sign number 6. Your family traditions feel older than Christianity itself. This is one of the most overlooked clues because Anglo-Saxon culture did not disappear after conversion to Christianity. Many customs survived by blending into later English traditions. Seasonal celebrations, harvest rituals, bonfire customs, protective symbols around homes or fields, superstitions tied to rivers, trees, crossroads, or specific times of year. Historians studying English folklore consistently find traces of pre-Christian Germanic traditions embedded inside rural customs that survived well into the modern era, especially in isolated countryside communities. Sometimes, a family preserves traditions far longer than it preserves memory of their origin. That is how culture often survives. Not through official history, but through repetition. Sign number 7. Your family stayed in one place for a very long time. This may actually be the strongest sign of all because ancestry survives through continuity. One of the biggest discoveries modern genealogy keeps uncovering is how surprisingly stable many English family lines remained for centuries. Some families stayed inside the same county for 300 years. Some remained tied to the same villages even longer. And when that happens, in regions with strong Anglo-Saxon settlement history, the odds of deep continuity rise dramatically. Especially because medieval England was not highly mobile for much of its history. Most ordinary people did not travel far. They married locally, worked locally, and were buried locally, meaning some modern families may still live remarkably close to where their early medieval ancestors once farmed the land under Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Not because they consciously preserved identity, but because history layered itself slowly, generation after generation, in the same landscape. And this is where the entire story becomes fascinating. The Anglo-Saxons were never truly a vanished people. They became part of England so completely that later generations stopped distinguishing where Anglo-Saxon ancestry ended and English identity began. The language evolved, the kingdoms disappeared, the world changed. But the people remained inside surnames, inside village names, inside DNA, and inside families who never realized their roots stretched back into the earliest foundations of England itself. That is why ancestry research changes how people see history. It turns abstract historical events into something personal. Suddenly, the migration across the North Sea is not just a chapter in a textbook. It may be part of your own story. If this video made you think differently about your family history, subscribe. I'm doing an entire series exploring hidden British ancestry, Viking DNA, Norman origins, forgotten migrations, Celtic myths, and the real history buried inside British surnames and family trees. And if you know where your family comes from, leave it in the comments. Because when thousands of people start comparing regions, surnames, and DNA patterns together, something fascinating happens. History starts becoming visible again.